Welcome to the Ghosts of Plum Run Hour on Midwestern Marks. I'm Tim Russo, author of the Star Wars series for leftists, Ghosts of Plum Run. This is the annotated audiobook series of the series. And what I'm going to do is read the book. So there it is. We're going to start out with the foreword and an introduction, and in each episode we will do a little annotation, sort of background on the project and the book. And today's episode, we are going to first talk about the cover. That's how we're going to annotate this episode. This episode will be a little shorter because most of the chapters are about 30 pages, so I don't know how long it's going to take to read one chapter. We'll find out. But as you can see, there are quite a few chapters. And we're going to begin with reunion. So let's get started. Let's jump right into it. And afterward, we'll have an annotation. Reunion, 1897. In the dry creek bed of Plum Run, a cat pawed at the feet of Rasselas Mowry, his stare fixed ahead at a memory. Mowry did not notice the photographer pouring powder into the flash lamp next to the camera's tripod. Half a dozen old men between Mowry and the photographer gingerly bent down to place themselves amidst the rocks, age creaking in their knees and their backs, while the youngest among them, age 50, chose the largest boulder to perch onto at the front of the shot. He struck his finest pose. 100 yards up the shallow slope of Cemetery Ridge, 3 more old-timers stood at the base of a brand-new granite plinth at the crest, atop which a solid brass soldier towered in bayonet charge at double quick, aimed at Plum Run below. They watched the younger man at the front, taking great pains that the camera catch his good side. I may have had too much to drink at the hotel last night, Henry Fifield wondered, squinting. But that's Billy Nixon, isn't it? One of your drummer boys, William Colville replied, leaning against a cane. A drummer boy himself during the war, Fifield was named drum major of the regiment in August 1863, 1 month after Gettysburg. So anyone in the regiment can be in that picture whether or not they were in the charge? Fifield said in disbelief. Nixon didn't make that stand in those rocks. Looks like he held off that brigade all by himself, Colville laughed. To be fair, it was a long night at the hotel, Charles Muller piped in. Maybe he's lost. Is this why you don't want to be in that picture? Fifield asked Muller, who just looked down at the ground. Colville chuckled. Guess that means you can get on in there too, Fifield, Colville said. Damn kid was barely any use at all, and now look at him, posing for the papers back home, Fifield said, agitated. Weren't you detached in Company C for duty at headquarters that day, Fifield? Colville asked. Indeed I was, Fifield answered. All I had to do with this charge was run down there and gather up you wounded, same as him. Fifield paused, staring down the ridge in disbelief, his anger growing. I know you can't get down this hill, Colonel, but Muller, you ought to get down there, Fifield said, waving his arms at the photographer. You were in this charge. Billy Nixon wasn't. Hands in his pockets at the base of the monument, Muller looked up at the bronze soldier. Oh, I think I'll let good old Billy Nixon take my place, Muller said. In a few years, Muller would change his German name, to Miller. If this monument had that serpent on it, Billy Nixon wouldn't be caught dead down there, Colville said. That was news to Fifield, who had developed a nose for news. After the war, Fifield became a newsman in Wisconsin, then Michigan, and by 1902 would own and edit the Wellington Enterprise in Lorain County, Ohio, just outside Oberlin. Though he was far removed from the 1st Minnesota's Veterans Affairs, reunions and meetings where such things as monument proposals were discussed, Fifield traveled from Ohio to Gettysburg in July 1897 with over 70 of the regiment's survivors from all over America for the dedication of the monument to the regiment's charge at sundown on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, July 2nd, 1863. They'd all spent last night at the Eagle Hotel, celebrated by Adams County locals and an enormous delegation arriving by train from both Minnesota and Washington. Hangovers gripped them all. "We proposed a serpent for this spot?" Fifield asked. "We did," Colville replied, leaning on his cane to steady his shattered body with the delicate care that only comes with 34 years of practice. Colville looked up at the statue. "That soldier up there was meant to be bayoneting a serpent." Now, that's the foreword that opens the book. So let's talk about this bayoneting serpent. Why is this a story for leftists? Why is the first Minnesota's charge a story for leftists? It begins, for most of us, with this statue, or proposal for their statue at Gettysburg. They wanted to bayonet a serpent. They wanted to be depicted as bayoneting a serpent. And what is there today is definitely not a soldier bayoneting a serpent. What is there today is a nondescript soldier charging at double quick down the ridge. In the research for the book, I learned that the first Minnesota veterans in 1889 proposed several statues for that spot, one of which is there now. Another one where a soldier is holding up his dying comrade. And the third one is this one, where the cover is now the cover of my book, Volume 2, Serpents and Dust, with a soldier bayoneting a serpent. And the reason this made it to the cover of my book and is the beginning of this series is that here you can see the dialectic. It's very rare to see evidence of the dialectic across 150 years, let alone in stone and bronze on a historic battlefield. But here we have the dialectic. So where is the dialectic in this statue? You can see that the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, when they decided not to use the statue with a soldier bayoneting a serpent, made a decision. And that decision really blew up when this image of this soldier bayoneting a serpent was posted by the Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook page this past summer. Right after, around the George Floyd protests, June, I believe, or July, sometime around the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, somebody at the Gettysburg Battlefield found this image of the soldier bayoneting the serpent, original proposed first Minnesota monument, and posted it on the Facebook page. And you can just imagine the surprise of the Confederate sympathizer audience that tends to make up the Civil War reenactor, battlefield visitor community. It blew up with about 900 comments on this one little image of a soldier bayoneting a serpent. And as soon as I saw that, I grabbed the image from the Battlefield Facebook page, and it is now the cover of Volume 2, and it will also be the cover of just about every other book in this series. And in addition, it's going to be the little graphic at the beginning of each chapter, such as Chapter 1, Breakfast in Uniontown. There you have our soldier bayoneting a serpent. Now, since we have a little more time, I'm going to just go right into Chapter 1 after the reunion. So, Chapter 1 is Breakfast in Uniontown. Ghosts of Plum Run, Volume 2, Serpents and Dust. June 30th, 1863. Morning, sir, Toby said to Colonel Colville, piercing the quiet like a bird's chirp, counting up rations from last night's haul. As day broke, Toby surveyed the embarrassment of riches before him when Colonel William Colville of the 1st Minnesota crawled out of his tent, raising his towering frame to stretch, yawn, and dress in the glow of sunrise. Colville seemed out of place, because he was, rubbing sleep from his eyes, wondering what to do with himself. Good morning, Toby, Colville managed through his splitting hangover, stumbling at the front of his tent, putting on his uniform. Toby shook his head with a chuckle. Coffee, sir? Toby asked, pouring a cup for the colonel. That is a fine notion, Colville muttered, struggling to the fire for his coffee, tumbling onto a stool. Some welcome we got last night, Toby said, handing Colville his cup. Colville paused, taking his coffee, smelling it, making sure he was able to drink it without making himself sick. Hesitantly taking his first sip of the day, Colville announced the obvious. I reckon this entire corps was drunk. Toby smiled. Gonna be a slow morning, Colonel. As it should be. These boys need a full day's rest after that march, Colville said, deciding it was safe to gulp down the coffee. Fine coffee you made, Toby. Never seen so much whiskey as this town poured out last night, Colonel, Toby said, refilling Colville's cup. We must never speak a word of it, Colville said. They were surrounded by food. Ham, bacon, biscuits, bread, apple butter, bread, potatoes, onions, milk, cakes, pies, a fire brewing morning's first coffee. Toby just stared at baskets brimming with Uniontown's bounty, laughing to himself. The ladies of Uniontown hadn't stopped showering the Second Corps of the Army of the Potomac with provisions of every kind since their first steps were heard from the southwest, marching into town the night before. Over the hills, north and west, cosmic cyclones exploded with eternal power as the first ghost of Gettysburg danced, a serpent in the valleys. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia unleashed a horror across the land. The ghost wind in Lee's sails, but calm across the hills, allowing Toby's campfire to brew his coffee. Duality, yin and yang, utopia to dystopia, the ghost rose to its crescendo that day. Tears shed by children tied into chain gangs, dragged along with Lee's army, coiling across the foothills of the Appalachians. The Confederacy's property had been stolen, so the first priority of Lee's men upon crossing the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania was to collect it. No African-American family was safe, no papers adequate, and no townspeople's begs for their neighbors mattered. Hundreds born free would learn for the first time, on June 30th, 1863, what Toby had learned from birth, slavery. The time had come. The ghost's power had multiplied like butterfly wings crossing the ocean into a typhoon. Over decades, the ghost haunted time and space around this lowly regiment, blowing a breath to turn Peter Marks down a lane in Cheshire, England, then blazing nightmares into his sleep, prodding him this way and that onto a boat for America. In blizzards across the prairie, the ghost transformed a little girl named Millie in St. Paul into a virtuoso fiddler and an Irish boy named Seamus to love her. In Rhode Island, the ghost cast spells of flies over little Marcellus Mowry through a witch who went on strike, whose long-dead husband once painted a cotton banner for her out of Negro cloth to march with. On a plantation in the Virginia Peninsula, the ghost lashed 10-year-old Toby relentlessly, then soothed him in his striped pants sewn by his aunties with scraps of the same Negro cloth in their slave quarters. And it gave a puppy named Flash a home with John Fisher on Cemetery Ridge in Gettysburg, where both waited for Toby's regiment to arrive in a day or two with Corporal Peter Marks and Private Marcellus Mowry. Power collapsed onto itself like spinning walls of a hurricane soon to peak. Such was the terror spread that day in Pennsylvania among people Mag Devitt was taught were somewhere between yellow or black, rounded up like wayward cattle. Lee's generals made special arrangements to bring their new contraband along with them on their march north. The new slaves' fates to be decided at an auction block one day. But for now, there was invasion to attend to, so these Americans endured a forced march across their own country, a rattle on the serpent's tail, in chains for days and days before being dragged to hell, Toby's old home, across the hills from their unheard wails. Toby noticed a lady approach the camp. "Are you the Minnesota boys?" Toby and Colville looked up to see Deborah Hamburg waddling toward them from town, the orange of sunrise behind her, a tiny girl in hand who carried a basket. Colville's hangover shot through him as Toby accepted that the love of Uniontown would smother them every moment they were there. Toby looked at Colville, who just rubbed his forehead. "More?" Toby laughed at Colville, who stood to greet the lady and waved, mightily attempting to summon sobriety somehow. "Colonel William Colville, 1st Minnesota, at your service, madam." Mrs. Hamburg shooed the little girl toward the camp. "Go on, take it to them." Mrs. Hamburg encouraged the child, who ran carefully toward the campsite, keeping the basket steady. "Give it to the gentleman at the fire," Mrs. Hamburg said, pointing the girl toward Toby. "I believe she called you a gentleman, Toby. Don't disappoint the young lady," Colville teased. Toby stood up, brushed himself off for presentation. "Fighting up north sure is different," Toby chuckled to himself. He bent toward the girl, who held out a basket of eggs. Colville and Toby both gaped in awe. "Can't remember the last time we had eggs here, ma'am," Toby said, bowing to the girl to take her basket. "Thank you very kindly." "Fresh this morning," Mrs. Hamburg declared, finally arriving in camp a bit winded. "We don't have enough chickens for this whole army here," Mrs. Hamburg admitted, waving demonstratively at the countless swarm of tents consuming her hometown. "But maybe just enough for the state my husband bought fur to make hats from." Colville's headache eased with reminders of home. "Well, well, a buyer of Minnesota furs," he said, bowing. "My husband, Mr. Frederick Hamburg, was this town's hatter," Mrs. Hamburg announced. "Fur from Minnesota was the finest." "Very kind of you to visit," Colville delighted. "Mr. Hamburg died last year, sadly," Mrs. Hamburg said, "or he'd be here himself. It falls to me to greet you. Your state helped raise many a family in this little village, Colonel." "We never expected such a welcome," Colville complimented. "When I heard there was only one Minnesota regiment here with this corps," Mrs. Hamburg said, "well, I just had to find it. Very glad to have you in Uniontown." Quaker by birth, about 25 miles north in Bendersville, Pennsylvania, in 1812, little Deborah Hewitt was raised to despise slavery in a close-knit nook of hills in Adams County, where Quaker farmers fought slavery with their every ounce, every breath. Only 8 miles south from Deborah's childhood home, down the Carlisle Road toward Gettysburg, lived William and Phoebe Wright, who began hiding escaped slaves with the support of the Quaker community of Adams County in 1819. When Deborah was 7, the Wrights became legendary on the trail northward for freedom, providing refuge for a constant stream of escaped slaves for over 4 decades. On occasion, William Wright enlisted Deborah's parents, the Hewitts, so little Deborah often met runaway slaves as a child. Strangers turned up all the time. She watched her mother always welcome strangers with food, and it stuck. So it came naturally to Mrs. Hamburg to organize Uniontown's entire agricultural output to deluge the Second Corps constantly until it marched out of Uniontown well-fed, well-rested. For this rest, the 1st Minnesota could not have fallen upon fresher linens and a more feathered bed. If paradise could be found in an America boiling with war in 1863, it was Uniontown, settled by German immigrants flowing southward through Gettysburg, barely 15 miles north. Uniontown began by straddling the intersection of 2 pikes between Hagerstown and Baltimore. Around 1745, a German named Peter Moser established a tavern at the crossroads where a tiny village calling itself the Forks grew amongst farms. Typical of the Pennsylvania Dutch Germans, they were a pious handful of yeoman farmers relying on the traffic to and from Baltimore for survival. In 1813, they renamed the Forks Uniontown, proposing to be the county seat of a new county called Union in honor of America's Union. But the first ghost of Gettysburg had other plans for the Union. In 1837, the new county would be named not Union, but instead after a slaveholder, Charles Carroll, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Despite owning slaves himself, Carroll opposed slavery. It is this crease where the first ghost of Gettysburg settled in. Just how this conflict affected Carroll's own mind manifested in an America split against itself in precisely the same way. It ate at him, slowly, like a cancer unseen but not bothered over very much. Like a ghost in the closet or the attic, always there. Thus, feeling a bit guilty enough about the whole thing, Carroll introduced gradual abolition into the Maryland legislature. But of course, Carroll never freed his own slaves. No, no, that wouldn't do. Carroll's end-of-life attempt to buy his way into heaven, still a slaveholder at the age of 91, was to be president of something calling itself the Auxiliary State Colonization Society of Maryland, whose goal was to send the slaves back to Africa. Sadly, Carroll never did send the troublesome Negroes away, but he did get a county named after him, so it all worked out just grand for him. Charles Carroll gone from this earth, the ghost remained in the county named for him. One day, the ghost blew a notion into a collection of Carroll County upper crust slaveholding folk who decided the first railroad in those parts wouldn't go not through Uniontown, but instead Westminster, only 7 miles away. Thus was the end of Uniontown's place on any map. It vanished into its own rolling valleys and farmland. The pattern was set. Money would follow slavery wherever it went in America. No-cost labor, an impossible profit incentive to resist, all up and down the chain of supply and demand. Any good or service, including within its price unpaid involuntary labor, had the advantage always, everywhere. It was an addictive lesson the entire country learned instinctively, consciously or not, the way a biological mutation works to ensure survival of a species or not. Then, if it works, is passed on to the next generation, and if it doesn't, is never repeated. The claws and fangs of an all-powerful profit incentive serpent sank deep into the soul of a nation. In this way, time forgot Uniontown, where labor was paid and voluntary until it became the oasis where the first Minnesota would get its final long day's repose before hurling itself into the ages against the serpent coiled around America, suffocating it. This serpent moved. Rumors were flying across Carroll County for weeks that Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was heading north. Uniontown had been tense with fear a good long while. Men on horseback scouting the countryside day and night to learn who was coming from where, when, how many. Were they Union troops, or was it Confederate Cavalry General Jeb Stuart, or one of Lee's corps? Certainty only arrived with a rider bursting into Uniontown from Union Bridge, the next town to the south and west, galloping through Main Street, calling out the news. "Hancock's Second Corps, it's our boys," the rider cried out. Sweet relief lifted worry from the town like sunlight dispatching a fog. Word spread across Carroll County like electricity until it reached Mrs. Hamburg in retirement after her husband's death, living quietly on her son's farm after she sold the hat shop on Main Street. "Are you sure," Mrs. Hamburg asked her son, desperation that it be true bursting within her. "They're coming up through Liberty," her son shouted in from the porch. "Then Johnsville, then Union Bridge, probably going through Muttontown, I'd guess. Then they are to rest here tomorrow. They've been marching all day, should be marching in here just after sundown." Mrs. Hamburg popped up from her chair. "John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave," Mrs. Hamburg proclaimed to the heavens. "Much work to be done." Life filled her again, like before her husband died. She met her husband, Frederick Hamburg, in Gettysburg, and they were married on the Hewitt family farm in Bendersville, Christmas Eve, 1835. By 1840, Frederick was ready to break out on his own from his father's farm. One day, Frederick met George Keller at his hat shop on the main drag in Uniontown. He gave it some thought, and by 1842 owned the building, setting up a home there for his wife, who bore him 5 children. As the town's leading lady, Deborah slowly shed her most conservative Quaker ways. Keller and Hamburg hats grew to employ a good chunk of Uniontown. The family joined the Uniontown Church of God, which took over the church first built by a Lonery among Presbyterians. Their small farm behind the hat shop gave Deborah plenty to work with when strangers popped in for Christmas galas, the town's July 4th do, or to throw a parade for the Union Army should it turn up, which it did. Since April 1862, when her husband Frederick died and the shop closed, the town had been consoling Mrs. Hamburg and her 5 children as they mourned, waiting for the moment when joy could engulf her again. Here it was. So Uniontown answered her call to action unanimously, as if the old hat shop roared into motion again. Children were dispatched to the fields to harvest whatever was ripe. Cows milked, fatted calves readied, every oven baked a pie, bread, or a cake, the air over Uniontown smelling like a bakery for miles around. Whiskey was suddenly everywhere. The one tavern in town filled jugs from their barrels. Every porch rail along the main road studded with whiskey bottles. The spot where the Second Corps would round a bend to enter town from Union Bridge bustled all afternoon as onlookers peered westward to catch the first glimpse of glinting steel from Union rifles. Uniontown's eyes were about to see the glory of the coming of the Lord, and Mrs. Hamburg felt alive for the first time since Frederick died. Pillars of Uniontown, Mr. and Mrs. Hamburg were convinced the railroad passed them by for Westminster because of slavery. That's where the money always went. Uniontown, built by German immigrants, watched over by a Quaker lady of the town herself, had no slaves and never would. Westminster, on the other hand, was plantation country, a town where slaves were auctioned off, sold onto railroad cars headed south. Frederick Hamburg didn't even like going to the train station to pick up fur for his hats. Deborah hated when her husband rode into Westminster, that pile of rubbish, she dubbed it. The railroad remained an unhealed scab carbuncled onto this little corner of Maryland, and no one ever forgot it. And Mrs. Hamburg needed no prodding to carry on about it, which she did under the rising morning in the Second Corps camp. You know, you could have arrived here by train, young man, Mrs. Hamburg barked at Toby, if this country had ever had half its wits about it. The little girl smiled at Toby knowingly. Toby winked back. Mrs. Hamburg carried on. It's better this way. His truth is marching on. Yes, it is, Madam, Colville replied. Would you like some coffee? No, thank you, Colonel. You know what they've been doing over there, Mrs. Hamburg continued, waving her hand at the hills westward. Toby knew what they were doing over there, so just busied himself with counting up eggs. We have some idea, Miss Land, and you men are all that stand between us and the devil himself. The little girl, already bored with the very familiar talkative grandmother routine, whispered to Toby, That's my grandmother. A fine lady, Toby answered. She likes to talk, the girl whispered further. Toby played along. Good. A lot of folks here to talk to. There's a ball tonight, the little girl divulged. Toby returned his best surprised look. A ball? Shh, the little girl shushed Toby, who shushed right back with a wink. Now, we're going to stop there, and we're going to come back in our next episode about the ball. But we will annotate this episode as I mark the book with a bookmarker with discussion of this Uniontown ball. Now, I have written about this on my website quite a bit. One of the things of many that attached me to this story and obsessed me with the First Minnesota's charge and as it applies to leftists is this ball, this welcome in Uniontown. It has been lost in history. And we're going to get a little granular here and not so leftist, but the reason really is Colonel Colville, who Colonel Colville does bear some responsibility for how this regiment has been forgotten, buried, its mythic charge lost, because Colonel Colville was a little bit absent-minded, and it comes through in almost everything you see from him. Even before he joined the regiment after Fort Sumter and after the charge, I'm sure it got worse, and there's evidence that it did. And one of the historical confusions that you have to navigate about this story is this entry into Uniontown by the Second Corps of the Army of the Potomac. And the leftist angle is that, again, like the statue, like the serpent monument, the soldier stabbing a serpent with his bayonet, you see the dialectic in the decades and in the century and a half since, and the argument being between the two moving sides of history is that no one would really welcome the Union Army into its village in northwestern Maryland at the time, there would not be such a welcome to an army such as the Army of the Potomac, when in fact there was. And there's enough evidence of it that it struck me that this was quite a welcome. So, the fiction part of this historical fiction book series can be found in how I describe that welcome. Now, that welcome may have been a bit less than what I imagined, but I imagine it was like Paris in 1944 when the Allied armies liberated Paris from the Nazis. It was one gigantic party. And the evidence for that is in a couple of letters that I've been able to find from soldiers, including one from the 1st Minnesota, Patrick Henry Taylor's diary of the day mentions this. And there's another letter or two from other soldiers and other regiments who note that Uniontown was flowing with whiskey the day they were there. That seems to indicate that this was quite a welcome. So we will come back. We will pick right back up with, in the middle of chapter 1 there, Breakfast in Uniontown, for the Ghosts of Plum Run Hour annotated audiobook only on Midwestern Marks. I'm Tim Russo, author of Ghosts of Plum Run. Thanks for joining us.